Hey guys, what is up? Welcome back to my channel. Many people feel that investing in the stock market is a complex subject, and one of the most common questions they face is who decides the price of a stock and how does the price of a stock change? So in today's video, I want to break down this topic and explain to you how stock prices are set and how does a stock price go up and down. By the end of the video, you know how are stock prices determined, who decides the price of a stock, and how stock prices work. If you are interested in learning more about investing, trading, and the stock market, make sure you hit that subscribe button if you haven't already yet, and the bell icon so that you get notified every single time I release a new video on this channel. Let's see how stock prices work. Let's establish the definition of what a stock price is. The price of a stock at any given time is the last price a share or stock is sold for. So this is the share price of Microsoft, which as of this filming of this video is quoted at $162.28. It means that the last time someone bought or sold the Microsoft stock, they did it at the price of $162.28. So this is the price that both the buyer and seller agree to transact at. So what makes the buyer want to buy Microsoft stock at $162.28 instead of, let's say, $100? And why is the buyer willing to pay a relatively higher price of $162.28 instead of a lower price of $100? And why does the seller want to sell at $162.28 instead of a higher price of, say, $200? To understand this, we need to take a look at the intrinsic value of a company. The intrinsic value of a company refers to the investor's perception of the inherent value of the company. So different investors have different ways of evaluating the intrinsic value of a company. They do their own analysis and form their own estimate of what they believe is the intrinsic value of a stock. And they will all come to different conclusions. So using the earlier example, the buyer who did his own analysis might believe that the intrinsic value of the Microsoft stock is $200. And even by paying $162.28 for the stock, he believes that the stock is still undervalued compared to its intrinsic value. Meanwhile, the seller, with his own analysis, believes that the intrinsic value of Microsoft is closer to $100. So by selling at $162.28, he is selling at a price higher than the intrinsic value of a company, which represents a good investment for him. That is why some investors buy at the current stock price while others sell, because these investors have different methods of evaluating the intrinsic value of the company. But the important thing to note here is that even though investors may have different ways of evaluating the intrinsic value of a company, the decisions that they make is guided by the principle of the intrinsic value of a company. So once investors have a sense of a stock's intrinsic value, they then bid to purchase the stock at prices they are comfortable with. Similarly, current share or stockholders who are looking to sell their shares will ask for prices which they think are fair based on their own estimated intrinsic value. Over the long term, a company's stock price tends to follow closely to its intrinsic value. Companies and businesses with increasing intrinsic value over time will see a similar increase in their stock price. On the other hand, companies and businesses with decreasing intrinsic value over time will see a decrease in their stock prices. Intrinsic value guides the stock price of a company over the long term. So now that we know that stock prices are determined by the intrinsic value of a company over the long term, the next question is, how does intrinsic value guides the stock price of a company over the long term? It is through demand and supply. If majority of the investors in the stock market believe that the current stock price is way below the intrinsic value, then they will want to buy the stock. And this creates more demand for the stock. And this buying pressure will push up the stock price. Similarly, if the majority of investors believe that the current stock price is way above the intrinsic value, they will want to sell their stock to make a profit before other investors realize and also start selling, which will then cause the stock price to fall and eat up their profits. So the selling pressure will push down the stock price. Let's take a look at an example of how demand and supply plays out in a mini market. Let's say, for example, that this mini stock market has only 3 participants. These 3 participants, let's call them Adam, John, and Jessica. Adam, John, and Jessica each own 10 shares of Company A. One day, bad news hits Company A and Company A faces a recall of their products. Adam, John, and Jessica, on hearing the news, decide to sell their shares at the current price of $100. Unfortunately for them, because of the bad news, there is only one investor who is willing to buy 10 shares at $100 each. Adam, being the first to put up his shares on sale, sold his 10 shares for $100 each. John and Jessica, however, did not manage to sell their shares at $100. There is no investor willing to buy the stock at the current price of $100. But one investor is willing to buy the stock at a price of $99, which is $1 lower than the current price. While Jessica was still contemplating whether to sell at $99, John decides to sell his 10 shares at $99 each. Once John makes the transaction, the stock price quoted in the stock market changes to reflect this latest price at which the stock is sold for. So in this case, it is at $99. By the time Jessica decided to sell her shares, there was no other investors that were willing to buy her shares at the current stock price of $99. The only way she could sell her shares was to lower her selling price to $98, where there were buyers waiting to buy at that price. Jessica decided to take the loss and sold her shares at $98 per share. After that transaction takes place, the stock price is then adjusted accordingly to $98. In the real stock market, at any given moment, there are thousands and thousands of buyers and sellers with different quantities of shares and prices. All these transactions are matched electronically by brokers who match buyers to sellers. Buyers and sellers analyze through their own different ways the intrinsic value of a company and make their decisions and transactions accordingly. These decisions and transactions make up the demand and supply in the stock market, which ultimately determine the stock price of a stock. In this video, I simplify things with assumptions to help explain the concepts. But in the real world, there are a lot more factors that come into play. For instance, I make the assumption that all investors make their investing decisions based solely on the intrinsic value of the company. What are some other things that investors take into consideration when investing in the stock market? Realistically, these investors make their decisions based on a mix of emotions such as greed and fear and the intrinsic value of the company. That is why stock market bubbles are created, whereby investors continue to buy and push stock prices of companies so far above their intrinsic value, even though these companies may already be overvalued. Factors such as these will affect the stock price of a stock, but this goes way beyond what I can fit into this video. You can check out my other video here on the PE ratio, as I share with you how investors can use the PE ratio to determine the value of a company. So that is how the stock price is determined. It is the investors like you and I who decides the price of a stock through our actions in the stock market. If there are more buyers than sellers, through the law of demand and supply, prices will rise. If there are instead more sellers than buyers, then prices will fall. That is how the price of a stock change and why some stock prices go up while others go down. If you have learned something in this video, let me know what is the biggest takeaway you have gotten from this video in the comments below. If you have liked the video, I've got a whole playlist dedicated to investing and trading for beginners and getting started in investing and trading in the stock market over at the end of the video. Make sure you check that out at the end of the video on the top right of your screen. I'll see you in the other videos. To your financial success.